Anyway, let us go to the third map. So what happens actually, as we said, is many neighboring Arab nations attack Israel. Israel actually loses 1% of its population in the war of 1948, in its independence war. Some of these people had just came back from the Holocaust, having survived the Holocaust, and yet Israel wins. Israel defeats these foreign armies, and now the state of Israel is expanded to what we see now, this white area. Now, before I go to Elan, let me say for me what jumps out as a big lie in this map. So from 1949 to 1967, in 1967 we have the Six-Day War, so we're going to talk in a bit about that. What is portrayed here is that the green area is Palestine, which is a huge lie. Elan alluded to it earlier. The wannabe conquering Arab armies did not want to create a Palestinian state. They wanted to grab whatever they could for themselves. So what you see there called Palestine, on what is today, we call it the West Bank, was an area that was occupied by Jordan. And what did the Jordanian army, actually that was the area of the Arab Legion fighting, what did they do there? Atrocities. They expelled every Jew and they destroyed the synagogues. And did they then declare this part of land to be Palestine? Of course not. This was Jordan. And the Gaza on the left towards the sea, this was part of Egypt. Of course, both areas had many, many refugees. But the question is, how did we end up with refugees in our hands? Well, we ended up with refugees because of the aggressive war of 1948. And many refugees actually left under the command, under the advice of the Arab leaders. So Elan, I wanted to set some very basic historical context because I think particularly this segment of the map is actually enraging in how it completely defies reality. What's your take on it?
I agree. I think the important piece that's being dropped here from the context is what you mentioned, which is that the Jordanian regime governed what is known as the West Bank, the big green part, and the Egyptians controlled what is the Gaza Strip. And neither was particularly motivated to support Palestinian statehood as a goal. They actually were opposed to it. The Egyptians in particular were quite brutal about it. They let the Palestinian factions operate within those areas. They didn't completely crush them, but they weren't particularly supportive either. And it would have been a shock to them, to Egypt and to Jordan, to hear that this is Palestinian land because they conquered it and they viewed it as theirs. And this was, so if you showed this map to them at the time, if this were a contemporary map, they would be outraged because this is certainly not a picture that their fallen soldiers had fought to conquer. I think the other piece of this, which is important, that isn't mentioned, and it's not at all what people who push this map want you to think about. Again, we're seeing that the outline of the map isn't changing. And Israel, colored in white here, is growing. And it's, again, it's not, this is not representative of population, this is sovereignty. And this is the toggling back and forth between those two is important because what is actually true of the green is that it's very densely populated and it's in both cases, whereas the white is not so. And so it's important to see that continual equivocation within the map. And I think the point you raised about what kind of state would you build, I agree, that's fundamental here. And that to me is why this isn't ultimately a land question. It's a question of what you would do with the land politically. What kind of society would you build? And we've seen the kind of societies the Palestinian cause has tried to build. And it's certainly not an ethnic or racial issue. I think it's important to just amplify your point on that. That's not at all how I think about this. I think it's a mistake to view it that way. And I think even though the participants on both sides often do view themselves in those terms, it's a mistake. I think it's not the right way to see it. And I think what we should do is talk about the final map. Or I think that there is one more panel, right?
Before we go to one last comment on this map, one last comment. At least we could say at that point, are the areas with the green, are they good neighbors to Israel? And the answer is, of course, no. The green areas are the grounds from which Fedayeen, these were so-called freedom fighters, they were starting raids, they were engaged in raids against Israel, raids that looked a lot like the monstrosities we saw on the 7th of October, which means raids to random Israeli communities, to random kibbutzes here and there, and then followed by massacres and murder and terrorizing the population. So keep this in mind as we go to the next map. So the next map is the aftermath of the Six-Day War of 1967. And of course, there's something here which is missing. And this is that first of all, in 1967, the Egyptian armies and from the north, the Syrian army are creating a circle around Israel. And also it's expected that Jordan might enter also the upcoming war. So Israel engages in a preemptive strike, it destroys the Egyptian air force, and then it beats both Egypt and Syria and Jordan. Jordan enters the war, although Israel pleads with Jordan, don't enter the war. So what is missing from this map is that, first of all, after 1967, all this area is white, all this area is occupied by Israel, and also more area on the south, the Sinai Desert, is occupied by Israel. Now, let us pause here for a second, because this is very important. How did Israel end up occupying the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights? Again, this supposedly legal occupation is key in the narrative of the Palestinians. So why did Israel end up occupying these territories? Remember, in 1967, Israel is fighting a defensive war. The Arab states, Egypt and Syria, were ready to attack Israel. There is very little doubt about that. Also, these areas, the West Bank and Gaza, but also the Golan Heights, were used as points of attack by the Arab countries against Israel. So it was a very important security concern for Israel. And remember, Israel pleaded with Jordan, do not enter the war. So if Jordan had not entered the war, the West Bank would not be occupied territories. If Egypt had not planned to attack Israel, the Gaza would not be an occupied territory, and if Syria had an attack, the Golan Heights would not have been occupied territories. So Israel had the right to keep these pieces of land. And how important these pieces of land were for its defense became evident some years later in 1973, where the Golan Heights and the Sinai Desert gave Israel the strategic depth that it needed to withhold the attack of Egypt and Syria, to withhold round 3 of their war against Israel. But Israel, when it realizes that at least some of its adversaries, in this case the Egyptians, are interested in a peaceful coexistence, it gives back Sinai. It gives back the Sinai. And actually what we see here is that after the 90s, Israel engages in talks with the Palestinians. And actually, it gives some administrative autonomy, some administrative rights in the Palestinians, both in West Bank, this is the dots on the center towards the north, but also in Gaza. And actually, since 2005, Israel completely removes itself from Gaza. The results, we see them today because a year later in 2006, Hamas gets control of the Gaza. And also something important, around that time, there are 2 offers to the Palestinians for a 2-state solution. One offer by Clinton and Ehud Barak around the Camp David, and another in 2008. Neutral people claim that these were good deals, but the Palestinians did not take them. So this is my historical context for this last map. So Elan, you wanted to talk more about this map. What draws your attention?
The first point I would raise here is that this is gliding over the so-called peace process that began in 1993 with the Oslo Accords, and that led to the West Bank becoming a Palestinian, West Bank and parts of Gaza becoming the beginnings of a Palestinian state under that agreement. This was the classic Land for Peace agreement. And the idea was that by 1994, the Palestinian Authority, which was the government in the making, would take over administration of the West Bank and then eventually all of Gaza. And that's what you see in the green bits on this map. Now, this is 2005. That's just more than a decade since the Palestinian Authority came into being. Why does it not look like a solid green the way it would if you saw the original maps that this peace agreement had been built on? Well, because the Palestinian National Authority, the proto-state, the beginnings of a state, was a failed state before it became completely sovereign. It was a dictatorial regime. It was stealing from its own people. It was carrying out and encouraging, fostering, and paying for attacks on Israel from within its territory, so to the extent it had sovereignty. It was anarchic in many ways between rival police forces. Just imagine what that looks like. Not rival armies, rival police forces, domestic conflict. So the West Bank that is taken over by the Palestinian Authority from 1994 onward is a catastrophic failed state, basically. Before it's even born, it's failed. And that is partly what Israel does in response to that. Is it starts clawing back authority. It starts bringing back its military. It starts to collaborate to make sure that it doesn't completely implode and become a worse threat than it already is. So the reason the Palestinian Authority isn't a solid green on this map is because it was not interested in becoming a state. It was interested in exploiting its own people and waging war on Israel. Now flip over to, so it's interesting, this is 2005, because as you pointed out, in 2005, Israel decided, forget Land for Peace. We're done with that. We tried that for a decade. It wasn't really a promising strategy because they did that with Egypt and that sort of worked. Egypt entered into a cold peace with Israel. They did Land for Peace with parts of where they were on the border with Lebanon. Not a great arrangement. And they did it with Palestinians. Catastrophic, right? So what happens in 2005, the Israeli government says, forget it. We're going to remove every last person, every last soldier who's in the Gaza Strip. We're going to hand it over to the Palestinian Authority. This failed state that I was describing, it's going to take over. And then a year later, with the blessing of the United States, they hold elections in the Palestinian Authority. So that's both Gaza and the West Bank. And this is when Hamas wins by a landslide. And now the Palestinian Authority and Hamas have a civil war, literally a civil war in Gaza. And it was brutal. And if you think you know brutal, you need to go read about what they were doing to each other in the streets of Gaza, the street fighting and the horrific conduct. The outcome of that is Hamas wins the Gaza Strip. So one way to look at this is the green is so fragmented. There's no land connection between the two. How would they ever build a state? That's part of what this map is trying to tell you. Look at how Israel's thwarted the Palestinian statehood. I think the truth is Israel made sacrificial steps towards enabling a Palestinian state. It blew up in its face. And the consequence is that there are now two Palestinian states. The Gaza Strip, ruled by Hamas, which hates the Palestinian Authority, which is ruled by Fatah and the PLO. So in effect, the Palestinians have more quasi-sovereignty than they ever did. Now, it's awful. No one, I think, would want to live there. No one would choose to emigrate there because it's such a terrible political environment. It's such a hostile environment for people who want to be free and produce. So this is part of what the map is not telling you. And it's the reality of two rival Palestinian states that would destroy each other if they had the means to do it, embedded within Israel. And so I have sympathy for the Israelis not knowing how to solve this because they tried Land for Peace. It didn't work the way they thought it would, but predictably it made things worse. Now, the final thing I'll say about this map is that it has to be understood, at least in part, in the debate within this space between the pro-Israel and the pro-Palestinian side. And the pro-Israel side has really well-developed narratives about some of what we've been talking about, some of which is true and I agree with, some of it is I don't agree with. And the map is calculated to respond to some of those talking points. And what are those talking points? One is that Israel has long been willing to trade land for peace. And